The carriage that brought Susanna Larkin to Wexmoor Hall was not sent for her comfort. It was a hired thing, its cushions gone flat with the weight of other people's journeys, its window strap broken and knotted, and it set her down at the foot of the great stone steps in a thin grey drizzle without a footman to hand her out, or a boy to carry what she owned. So she carried it herself. She took the leather handle of her single trunk in both gloved hands and drew it out of the carriage, and she felt the whole front of the house turn its attention on her before she had seen a single face at any window. A woman who has been watched all her life learns the weight of it on her shoulders, the way a farmer learns rain, by the change in the air before the first drop falls. She squared herself under it, and she began to haul the trunk up the steps, one at a time, the iron corners knocking on the wet stone, and she did not look up at the windows, because looking up was a thing that invited the eye, and she had spent the better part of her life teaching herself not to invite the eye. She wore long lace gloves that climbed past her elbows, and she wore them though the day was mild for the season, and the drive from the village had left her overheated beneath her travelling cloak. The gloves were the first thing anyone noticed about her, and they were meant to be. They were fine, or fine enough, ivory lace gone the colour of old teeth at the seams, and they fitted her arms so closely that they seemed less a thing put on than a thing that had grown there. A lady might wear such gloves to a summer ball and be admired for them. To wear them arriving in a wet spring, still wearing them while she dragged her own box up a duke's front steps, was to announce without a single word that here was a person keeping something covered and daring the world to ask what it was. That was the question she carried up the steps with her, plainer than any of her belongings, and it was the question the whole house would carry for weeks, unasked and unanswered, until the night it tore itself open. No one at Wexmoor asked her that afternoon. That was the first thing she learned about the house, that it was a place where a great deal was noticed and nothing at all was said, and it told her more than an hour of conversation could have. She had been handed over the way a debt is handed over, because that was precisely what she was. Her guardian, Quentin Vernon, master of the Larkin Mill that had once been her father's, owed money he could not pay, and he had found a way to pay it that cost him nothing he valued. The Duke of Wexmoor held the mortgage on the mill through a chain of paper that Susanna herself had traced late at night by the stub of a candle, following the debt from the mill to a bank in the county town, and from the bank to the ducal estate that had bought the note when the bank grew nervous. Vernon had gone to the Duke and offered the only asset he had left that the ledgers did not already claim. He had offered her. There had been a document. There had been a settlement drawn by a solicitor in a market town, in which the mortgage upon the mill was forgiven entire in exchange for a marriage, and in which the name Susanna Larkin appeared 4 times as a party to the deed, and not once as a person with a wish of her own. Vernon had settled a marriage portion upon her, under that same deed, a handsome dowry that made him look before the whole county the very picture of a generous guardian doing well by his ward, and the Duke had forgiven the mortgage in exchange for the marriage, and taken the portion along with the bride. What the Duke wanted from so strange a bargain she came to understand only later, and it was in its own way as cold as Vernon's arithmetic. A duke without a son was a title bleeding slowly toward some distant cousin, and Wexmoor wanted an heir, and wanted none of the price that came with getting one the ordinary way, the season in town, the ambitious mothers, the fresh young daughters, who would expect to be courted and cherished and loved by a man who had buried the whole of his love 3 years before, a wife handed to him as a debt discharged, asked nothing of his heart, promised nothing to the county, and made no pretence of a feeling he no longer believed himself able to give. Vernon had offered him exactly that, and the mortgage was a small enough thing for a man of his estate to let fall, and so the 2 men had shaken hands over her as over a parcel of land. She had read that document too. She read everything. It was the one power no one had ever thought to strip from her, because no one had ever thought a millmaster's ward would have it. People who lived warm and safe by their own fires would say afterward, as such people always do, that a woman of 25 need not have gone, that she might have taken a post as a companion to some elderly lady, or as a governess, or hired herself out to keep a shopkeeper's books. Susanna had turned each of those doors in her hands, and found them all locked, and locked by the same man. A governess required references, and every reference she could give ran back through Vernon, who would give none but the kind that ended a hiring before it began. A companion or a shop clerk required hands that could be shown across a table to the lady or the master doing the hiring, and her hands could not be shown. There was no aunt in a distant county. The fever that took her parents had taken the last of her blood along with them. And the debt itself was real, and the paper was real, and the mill and the 50 families whose bread depended on the mill were real, and Vernon had made certain, with the cold thoroughness he brought to every calculation, that every road out of the bargain ran back through the toll gate of his own consent. She had gone over it, and over it, the way she went over a column of figures that would not balance, and she had found no error in it, no door he had left unlocked. So she had signed because a signature was the only move left on the board, and she had drawn on her gloves, and she had come. She set the trunk down on the top step and put her back to the great door, out of an old habit, so that nothing could come at her from behind. And while she waited, she did what she always did, in a new and dangerous place. She counted it. She counted the windows across the front of the house, and the chimneys, and the number of steps she had climbed, and the seconds between the last knock of the iron corner on the stone and the first sound of a bolt drawn back inside. A place that has been counted is a place a little less able to surprise you, and being surprised was, in Susanna Larkin's long experience, the thing that got a person hurt. The great door opened at last, when she no longer needed it opened, and a butler with a face like a shut drawer looked down first at her, and then, with visible reluctance, at the trunk. "Her Grace," he said, in the tone of a man reading aloud a word he did not believe, "is expected." He did not reach for the trunk. A younger man came up behind him and did, and Susanna let it go and flexed her fingers once inside the lace, and followed the two of them across the threshold into the house that was now, by law and by paper, and by no wish of hers, her home. It was a house built to make a person feel small, and it was very good at its work. The hall rose 2 full stories to a ceiling of painted clouds, its floor a great chessboard of black and white marble, the whole of it arranged to be looked at rather than lived among. Susanna stood in the middle of the board, a small figure in wet travelling wool, and she did not gape at the ceiling as she was clearly meant to. She chose a place near a pillar where she could see both the door she had come in by and the sweep of the great staircase. She folded her gloved hands in front of her at the waist, and she went still. It was not the stillness of a woman at peace. It was the stillness of a creature that has learned that movement draws the eye, and the eye draws the blow, the same stillness she had held as a child in a cold glass house when Vernon's step came down the gravel path, and she wore it now in a duke's marble hall as naturally as she wore her gloves. She had learned her figures in a room that smelled of lamp oil and ink, on her father's knee, his patient finger guiding hers down the columns of the mill's books. Josiah Larkin had believed that a head for numbers was the nearest thing to a suit of armour that a person born without money could ever own, and he had given his daughter that armour before he gave her anything else, before he taught her her letters almost, certainly before he could guess how badly she would come to need it. He had shown her that a figure is a kind of promise, and that a book of figures kept honestly is a place where the truth cannot easily hide, and where a lie, once written down, leaves a shape you can find if you know how to look. He had died of a fever in the autumn of her 11th year, and her mother of the same fever a fortnight after him, and the mill, mortgaged to its rafters, had fallen with the girl into the guardianship of the man who held the nearest of its debts, Quentin Vernon. Vernon had kept the mill, and he had kept the girl, and he had discovered very quickly that the girl was worth more to him working than idle. He had lately built a great glass house against the south wall of the mill yard, a costly modern thing of iron and glass in which he raised pineapples and early grapes and hothouse peaches for the tables of the gentlemen he wished to be seen among, and it was in that glass house that Susanna's hands were ruined. The fruit needed heat, and the heat came from iron flues that ran in a maze beneath the raised beds, carrying the warmth of a furnace stoked day and night, and the flues where they joined ran red in the dark and were never lagged, because lagging cost money and a girl's hands did not. A child sent to bank those fires in the black cold of a winter morning, half asleep, her breath smoking, would learn the exact geography of that iron the hard way, and she would go on learning it, because a burn heals and a furnace does not put itself out. The first time was an accident. Susanna had held to that word for years, the way you hold to a rail on a dark stair. The first time was an accident. The times that came after Once Vernon had observed that a burned girl worked as steadily as a whole one, and complained a great deal less, were not accidents at all, but the ordinary working of a mind that had done the sum, and found that her suffering was cheaper than iron cladding, and cheaper than a grown man's wage, and had chosen accordingly coldly again and again as a matter of policy. That was the thing she had never been able to make anyone understand who had not seen it. It was not rage that had burned her. It was arithmetic. The marks the flues left were across the palms and the backs of both her hands, and climbed her wrists in ridges and in smooth, shining valleys, where the skin had melted and knitted itself again wrong. They were not marks a person could look at and mistake for anything else. They were the map of her childhood, and anyone with eyes could read the country. And so she wore the gloves, and had worn them for years, not out of vanity, of which she had almost none, but because she had watched, again and again, what a bare hand did to a room. She had watched the small recoil, the flinch quickly mastered, the pity that curdled within a breath into distaste, the way a stranger's whole estimate of her plummeted, in the instant they saw the plain evidence that she had been used as a thing is used. The gloves were not concealment for concealment's sake. They were the only device she had ever found that let a person look at her face while she spoke and weigh her words before they decided what she was worth. And she kept them, which was the part comfortable people never troubled to imagine, the way any secret must be kept, which is to say, maintained, worked at, like any machine that must run without fail. She owned 4 pairs, washed and mended in their turn, so that one might dry while another was worn and a third lay ready. She had taught herself to wash and dry her own hands, and draw fresh gloves over them without any maid so much as glimpsing what lay between the taking off and the putting on, and she had drilled herself in it until it was as smooth and thoughtless as a soldier loading in the dark. When she bathed, she bolted the door and told the maid she had a horror of being seen at her toilet, which no lady thought strange. When she slept in thin cotton gloves, so that a chambermaid drawing the curtains at first light would see only a lady with some delicacy about the hands, some sensitivity to cold. It was not comfortable. Comfort had never once been among the things offered to her, but it was possible, and she had made it possible for years without a single slip, and she saw no reason on that wet afternoon why it should not go on being possible for as many years more as she required of it. The first member of the household to seek her out was not her husband. It was his sister. Lady Isadora Kingsley came to Susanna's rooms on the second morning, unannounced, in the manner of a person establishing at the outset that no door in the house was truly shut to her. She was perhaps 10 years the elder, handsome in the hard, bright way of a woman who has long since decided that softness is a form of foolishness, and she came in already speaking, already wearing the smile that Susanna would come in time to understand was the most dangerous single thing in the house. "My dear," she said, "how very glad I am to see you settled. I do hope Bess has made you comfortable. She is a good girl, if a little slow." She moved as she talked, touching things, straightening a candlestick upon the mantel that stood in no need of straightening, adjusting the fall of a curtain, and Susanna understood that this too was a language, that Isadora was marking the room as her own even in the act of welcoming another into it. "You will forgive me if I speak plainly," Isadora went on, settling at last into the better chair, "for I believe you to be a sensible person, and sensible people prefer plain dealing. This is a great house, and it runs in a certain way, and it has run so through a very difficult time. My brother has not been himself these 3 years past, not since he lost his wife, and I do not say that for your pity, but so that you shall understand the shape of things as they stand. I have carried this house upon my own 2 shoulders in all that time. The keys, the servants, the accounts, the ordering of the season, the invitations, every particle of it is already seen to, and seen to well. You need trouble yourself with none of it. You have only to be pleasant and quiet, and to leave my brother his peace, for he has had disturbance enough to last a man a lifetime." She let the warm smile widen, which was somehow worse than any frown. "We shall get on famously, I am quite sure of it, so long as we each of us keep to our own garden." Susanna heard everything that lay beneath it, the way she heard the false figure under a smooth column. She heard most of all a frightened woman, though the fear wore fine silk and a fine accent and would have died sooner than name itself. Isadora had built her whole life, brick by brick, out of being necessary to this house, and here across the hearth sat a stranger, a millmaster's ward in yellowed lace, who by one stroke of the law now stood above her beneath her own roof, and who might, should she choose, take the keys and the ledgers, and the standing that were the only things in the world Isadora truly possessed. Susanna understood the whole of it in the time it took to fold her hands, and she felt, beneath her wariness, something that was almost fellow-feeling, for she too knew exactly what it was to hold with both hands to the one thing that could not be allowed to be taken. But fellow-feeling was a luxury, and she had learned young to spend her luxuries carefully, so she folded it away with the rest and answered in the level, brief voice that gave nothing back. "You have carried a great deal," she said. "One can see it in the house. It is very well kept." She let that stand a moment. A thing that was at once a courtesy and a plain fact, and a quiet notice served that she had eyes and used them. "I have no wish to disturb his grace." That too was true, and gave away nothing, and most importantly, promised nothing. She did not promise to stay clear of the accounts. She watched Isadora wait for that promise, watched the pause stretch and the smile hold and the wait go unrewarded, and the not giving was the whole of the conversation, everything that mattered in it. Isadora's smile thinned by a single degree. She rose, took up her shawl, said something bright about dinner, and went. Susanna stood a while after the door had closed, looking at the candlestick her sister-in-law had straightened, and then, without hurry and quite deliberately, she moved it the half-inch back to where it had stood. It was a small thing. She was not yet a woman who could afford large things, but she had learned long ago that a person who will not be moved on the smallest matter is understood, in time, to be a person who cannot be moved at all, and she meant to be understood. The Duke came home on the 4th day. Susanna heard the horse in the courtyard before she heard anything else, and then the change that ran through the house at the sound of it, the way the servants' voices dropped and quickened together, and she came down to the hall because it seemed to her that a wife, even a wife made of paper, ought not to be discovered hiding when her husband first walked into the house that was now to hold them both. Thaddeus Kingsley, Duke of Wexmoor, was a tall man gone thin at the edges the way grief thins a man from within, dark-haired with an early grey coming in at the temples, and with a face that had decided, some while ago, to show the world nothing at all. He was perhaps 35. He crossed the marble chessboard toward her, and stopped a careful distance off, and he looked at her with an expression she knew at once, because it was so very like her own, the look of a person braced to get through a transaction they had not wanted, and meant to see done with what dignity could be salvaged. "Madam," he said. He did not call her wife, nor by her name, nor your grace, which would have been absurd from him. He said, "Madam." The word a man gives a stranger across a shop counter, and she saw that he had chosen it with care, that it was a line drawn in the air between them, meant to keep them each safe on their own side of it. "I trust you have been made comfortable. I regret I was not here to receive you. My business does not always keep to the hour." He spoke as a man reads out terms he expects to be disputed. She answered him in kind. "I have been made comfortable," she said, which was near enough to true. "Your house is very fine." And then, because she had decided upon the long cold drive that she would not spend this marriage as a decoration in a glass case, because being decorative had never once in her life kept her safe, and being useful now and then had, she said the thing she had prepared. "I wonder, your grace, whether I might be permitted to see the household accounts. I have some skill with figures. I should not like to sit idle, and I should not like to be a cost to a house without being also of some use to it." She watched his face as she said it, watched for the flicker she was used to, the contempt or the amusement, the look that said a woman and figures, how quaint, how charming. It did not come. Something else moved behind his careful eyes instead, a quick recalculation, as if she had spoken a sentence in a language he had not thought she could speak. He was silent long enough that Isadora, hovering as ever at the foot of the great stair, filled the gap with a light laugh, and a remark upon how eager her new sister was to be helpful, and how there was truly no need to trouble her pretty head. The Duke looked at his sister. Then he looked back at Susanna. "We shall see," was all he said. But he had heard her, and she had learned in a hard school to tell exactly when a thing had landed, and when it had glanced off, and this had landed, and gone deep. The first weeks at Wexmoor settled slowly into a shape, and Susanna learned the shape of them the way she learned everything, by watching and counting, and by asking small questions of the people no one else troubled to ask anything of. She rose early, out of the long habit of a body trained by cold mornings, and drew on her gloves in the dark before Bess came to lay the fire, and she spent the mornings walking the house and its offices, learning where the still room stood in relation to the kitchen, and where the muniment room lay off the library, and which of the servants would meet her eye, and which would not, and why. Bess, the chambermaid whom Isadora had named good but slow, proved on acquaintance to be neither slow nor, as it happened, entirely loyal to the lady who had once ordered her whipped for a broken dish. Bess trusted Susanna at once, in the sudden and complete fashion of a person who has gone a very long time without being spoken to, as though she were a real creature with a mind of her own. And Susanna, who trusted almost no one alive, found to her own quiet surprise that she trusted Bess in return. The two of them formed the kind of low alliance that runs far beneath the notice of the people who believe they command a house, an alliance of small warnings and smaller kindnesses, of a fire laid a little earlier on a bitter morning, and a word passed quietly about which way the mistress's temper ran that day. But it was Mr. Halloway, the steward, who gave Susanna her first true footing in that place. He was an exacting man, spare and grey, who had served the estate above 30 years, and had watched its accounts slide into a genteel disorder through the long years of the Duke's grief, and he did not at first welcome a duchess with opinions about his ledgers. He was fair, however, fair to the marrow, and he was above all a man who cared a great deal more that the books be right than for whose hand it was that set them right. So when Susanna, granted at last a grudging afternoon in the estate office among the great bound volumes, ran a gloved finger down a column of the grain accounts, and stopped it, and said quietly, "Here, this is wrong." He came to look over her shoulder more from irritation than from any hope. She showed him a charge of £38, carried forward from the previous quarter, entered against grain delivered to the Home Farm's North Barn. Then she showed him the barn's own receiving book, which she had asked to see that morning, and in which no such grain had ever been written down as arriving. It was not a great sum, £38. It was exactly the kind of sum that hides in a large estate's accounts as a single false coin hides in a full purse, that no one ever finds, because no one ever counts the whole purse at once against everything it ought to hold. Susanna had counted the whole purse in an afternoon. Halloway looked at the phantom charge for a long moment, and then he looked at the receiving book, and then he looked at her, and something in his exacting grey face quietly rearranged itself. "Well," he said, and then, after a pause, in a different voice altogether, "Your Grace." It was the first time anyone at Wexmoor had said those two words to her, as if they carried weight, and she found she remembered it long after. The Duke heard of it, as the master of a house hears of everything at last, and he came to find her where she had by then begun, with Halloway's grudging blessing, to bring some order to the muniment room, a stone chamber off the library into which a century of the family's papers had been thrown and forgotten, charters and leases and marriage settlements, and the accounts of dead stewards all tumbled together in damp confusion. He stood in the doorway a while before she marked him, and when she rose he waved her down again. "Halloway tells me," he said, "that you found £38 no man in my employ could find. He tells me you found it in a single afternoon." There was a note in his voice she could not at once name, and then she named it, because the naming of feelings precisely was another of the weapons her father had left her, and it was not suspicion at all. It was interest. He was interested. It had been, she thought, a long time since anything under that roof had interested him. It was not difficult, she said. It was only that no one had held all the books open at once. A figure that is wrong in one book is very often right in another, and you have only to lay both of them open together and read across. She hesitated, then went on, because he seemed to want more of her words rather than fewer. "My father taught me. He kept a mill. He used to say that figures do not lie, but that men lie in figures, and that the second is a wholly different skill from the first, and the one worth the learning." The Duke was quiet a moment, and she thought perhaps she had said too much, as she so seldom did. But when he spoke again it was to ask her another question, and then a third, and they fell into talk in the dusty stone room among the ruin of his ancestors' papers, about accounts and about her father's mill, and glancingly about his own estate and the troubles that had crept into it. And it was, she understood only afterward, as she climbed the stairs to dress, the first true conversation she had had with another living soul in longer than she cared to reckon. He seemed, when he left her, faintly startled at himself, and the next day he was cool again, formal, the line in the air redrawn between them, and she understood that too, understood that he had frightened himself by being warm, and had drawn back from the warmth as a man draws his hand from a stove, and she did not press him. She had waited patiently for larger things than one man's trust. She could wait for this. Isadora, who watched all of it with the sharpened attention of the frightened, did not wait for anything. She had marked the afternoon in the muniment room and the hour behind the door, and she began the small mean war that frightened people wage, the war of the moved object and the barbed remark dressed up as tender concern. She shifted the clock upon the morning room mantel a full 2 feet along the shelf one morning to learn whether the mill girl would notice, and Susanna, coming into her afternoon's work, noticed it in the first second and said nothing whatever and moved it back. Isadora told the cook, within Susanna's hearing, that her grace was not to be consulted upon the menus, as she had not been reared to such things and would only be made to feel her ignorance. She said over dinner, with the very warmest of her smiles, how brave it was of dear Susanna to take such an interest in the men's side of affairs, and how her own late mother had always held that a wife kept her accounts in her husband's contentment and nowhere else at all. Susanna received each of these small blows in precisely the same manner, level and brief, refusing at once the submission that Isadora wished from her, and the open quarrel that Isadora could have made good use of, and the refusal enraged Isadora far more than any answer could have done, because it left her striking again and again at a thing that would neither strike back nor fall down. Yet the house was thawing for all that, by inches too small to measure day to day, and plain enough across a fortnight. The muniment room came slowly into order beneath her hands, the charters sorted by reign and the leases by farm and the old accounts bound up by decade, and the Duke took to asking her of it at dinner, at first a single question, and then, as the weeks went, whole quarters of an hour of talk, while the covers were removed and Isadora sat rigid at the foot of the table, and the candles burned down, and the conversation lingered past every hour that a merely formal marriage required of it. He told her once, unasked, of a great-grandfather who had gambled away a second estate in a single season, and laughed, actually laughed, a rusted, unused sound, when she said that she had found the very vowels of it stuffed into a charter box, and had wondered which ancestor to blame. It was not intimacy. Neither of them yet had a word for what it was, but it was no longer nothing, and both of them knew it, and neither said so. The true turn came upon a wet afternoon in the muniment room, when the Duke brought her the subscription books of the charity school. He came in that day without his usual armour of formality, and he sat down across the deal table from her, and set a heavy-bound ledger between them, and she saw that his hands were not entirely steady upon it. "I want your eyes upon something," he said, "and I want your discretion, and I ask it of you as I would ask it of Halloway, because I have come to believe you may see what neither he nor I can find." The book was the account of a charitable subscription, a fund raised across the whole county over 11 years for the schooling and the keep of orphaned children, and it was held and administered, she saw as she turned to the front matter, by a board of trustees on which sat several of the great names of the district, and, as treasurer, managing the whole of it in their trusting name, one Quentin Vernon of Larkin Mill. She went very still, the old glass-house stillness, and the Duke, watching, mistook it. "You know the name," he said. "He is your guardian, the man who arranged our marriage. I know it is a delicate thing to set before you, but there have been whispers that the fund does not hold what it ought, that the schoolmasters have gone unpaid and the children ill-fed, and I sit upon that board, and I will not have my name standing upon a theft. If you cannot look into his books, I shall understand it, and think none the less of you." "I can look into his books," Susanna said. "I have looked into his books before," and she bent her head over the ledger, and the room went quiet around her, and she read. She read the way she had read as a child by the red light of the flues, quickly and wholly, and within the hour she had it, in part because she already half knew the shape of the thing she was hunting, in part because some corner of her had been hunting it for 10 years without any hope of ever running it to ground. She showed him the subscriptions flowing faithfully in, the county's charity gathered year upon year and set down honestly enough in the receiving column, the widow's shillings and the squire's guineas. And then she showed him where it flowed out again, to a coal merchant who had delivered to one small schoolhouse sums of coal that would have heated a cathedral through 3 winters, to a builder paid handsomely and repeatedly for repairs to a roof that a second book, did such a book exist, would surely show had never once been mended, to suppliers of bread and cloth and slates whose names, she would wager her life, belonged to no living man. She showed him the pattern of it, the way a charge that wore the honest face of a payment was in truth a pocket, the way the money did not so much vanish as walk quietly out of one column and fail ever to arrive in any other. "It is the same hand as your grain," she said. "It is always the very same trick, only grown larger with practice. A charge dressed as a payment and pocketed at the door. He has been at it for years. I could prove the whole of it, every figure if I had the other book, the book that shows the far end of the money, the receiving of it." She lifted her eyes to his. "I know that such a book is kept, because I have seen it kept." The Duke looked at her across the little pool of candlelight on the old table. "And do you have it?" he asked slowly. "That other book?" She had known, from the moment he set the ledger down, that this was the fork in her road, that she must now either go on lying by her silence as she had lied for years, or lay down at last the thing she had guarded through all of them. She looked at his face, at the guilt and the resolve struggling in it, and she made the calculation, as she made every calculation, and she chose. "I have kept my own accounts," she said, "since I was 15 years old, of everything I saw in that house and could not say aloud. It is written in a hand no other person can read, a cipher my father devised for the mill's true books. The honest ones he kept in secret against the day a creditor should try to cheat him. I have every figure of it. I have where the orphan's money went because I stood in the yard and watched it go. I saw it pay for his horses and his hothouse and his good wine. I saw it pay in the end for the marriage portion he settled upon me before your county, the very dowry that dressed the selling of me up as an act of a guardian's kindness. I have it, all of it, locked in the trunk I carried up your steps. I have carried the proof of his ruin into your house under my own arm." She had never told a living soul any part of it. The saying of it aloud to another human face in a quiet room undid some old welded thing in her chest that she had believed shut past any opening years before, and her voice, level all her life, was for one moment not quite level. And then, because the room had already gone somewhere far past caution, because he was looking at her as though she were the first entirely true thing he had seen in 3 grey years, she did the thing she had sworn to herself she would never do in any house on earth. She laid both her hands flat upon the table between them, and slowly, finger by finger, she began to draw off the long lace gloves. "You should know what it is you are choosing to trust," she said. "You should know the whole of it, and not the half." The lace came away from her fingers, from the backs of her hands, from her wrists, turned half inside out, and she folded the gloves and set them aside, and she turned her hands palm upward in the candlelight and let him look his fill. The ridged and shining scars, the melted valleys, the whole map of the iron flues written into her flesh from the fingertips to the wrist and beyond. She did not weep, and she did not look away from his face while he looked at her hands. "The glass house," she said, "he heated it with iron flues that ran beneath the beds, and he sent me down to bank the fires in the dark of the morning when I was a child, and iron in the dark burns a half-sleeping child who cannot see it. The first was an accident. The rest were only what happened after he had done the sum, and found that a burned girl worked as cheaply as a whole one, and cost him no cladding for his pipes. I wear the gloves, because a bare hand ends a conversation before ever the words in it are heard. I'm not ashamed of them, and I would have you understand that plainly. What I feel, looking down at them, is not shame." She turned her hands over again slowly, and she named it for him exactly, in the way her father had taught her, that a feeling named is a feeling brought to heel. It is anger. It has only ever been anger, from the first day to this one. I learned very young that anger kept quiet is a thing a person can carry a long way, and that anger spoken aloud by a girl with no name and no money and no one at her back is a thing that gets her put out into the road. So I kept it quiet. I have been keeping it quiet a very long time." The Duke did not reach for her hands, and she was grateful to him for that, for pity offered too quickly was only another form of the recoil she had spent her life avoiding. He looked at them a long moment, and then he raised his eyes to her face, and when he spoke his voice had roughened at the edges. "I shall tell you something," he said, "since we are telling things tonight, so that you may know you have not put your neck into the hands of a man who keeps his own throat well covered." And he told her, haltingly, stopping and beginning again, in the broken register of a man who has never once said the thing aloud and is discovering only now what it cost to say. He told her of his first wife and of the child, of the fever that had come up through the tenant cottages one autumn, and how his wife had wished to go down among them and nurse the sick, as the Lady of Wexmoor had always done in living memory, and how he, who had lost his own father to just such a fever as a boy, had begged her not to go, and then, when she was set upon it, had not forbidden her, had not put his own body between her and the door, but had stood back at what he called a respectful distance out of a caution that he now knew to have been nothing finer than fear. She had taken the fever from the cottages. So had the child, an infant of not 4 months. He had lost the both of them inside a single week, and he had spent the 3 years since telling himself every day that a bolder man, a man who had acted where he had only stood, might have kept them living. "I made a religion of distance," he said very low. "I called it dignity, and it was cowardice in a better coat. I stood at a careful distance from my own wife because I was afraid, and she died of it, and I have stood at a distance from every living thing since, from my sister, from my house, from my own name, from you, madam, since the hour you came." He stopped and he looked down at her scarred hands lying open on the table between them, and he said, in a voice gone quite steady at last, "I do not intend to stand at a distance from this." They did not speak of love that night. It was too soon by far, and they were neither of them people who reach for a great word before its hour. But something had shifted in the stone room, and did not shift back, and when Susanna drew her gloves on again, it was of her own free choosing and not from any fear, and when the Duke rose to go, he paused at the door and turned. "Keep the ledger locked," he said. "Trust Bess, and trust Halloway, and trust no one else beneath this roof. I am writing tonight to a solicitor in London, and to a man who makes it his profession to look quietly into such matters, and it will take some weeks to have back what I need to move against Vernon without any hope of his wriggling free. Until then we must give no sign whatever. Can you go on as you have been going? Can you bear a while longer to be underestimated by everyone who looks at you?" And Susanna nearly smiled, for it was the single thing in the whole world she was most certain she could do. "I have borne it my whole life," she said. "A few weeks more is nothing at all." He nodded, and something passed between them that was not quite a smile on his side either, and he left her to lock the book away in its box, which she did, and set the box beneath the false bottom of her trunk, where it had ridden all the long way from the mill. He did not tell her all of what he did in the days that followed, but she came to see the shape of it, for she had a sharp eye for the shapes of things done quietly. A new lock appeared upon her door, and a second key given only into her own hand. Bess was moved, without fuss and without reason offered, to sleep in the little room adjoining, where before she had slept 2 floors below among the other maids. When Susanna went walking in the park, a groom now happened, always, to have some errand that carried him the same way at a distance. None of it was ever spoken of. It was the language of a man who had resolved never again to stand back at a careful distance, and who had not yet found the courage to say so in any tongue but this one, and Susanna, who had spent her life reading what people would not say, read it, and was moved by it more than any spoken thing could have moved her. But Isidora had grown watchful in her fear, and the changed thing in the house did not slip past her. She could not have put a name to it, and had no need to. She saw her brother go to the muniment room and stay, and come out with his grey face altered. She saw the mill girl grow easy in her stillness where she had before been braced. She saw the new lock and the moved maid, and drew from them the general truth, if not the particular one. And Isidora, who had built her whole self upon being the one her brother turned to in his troubles, felt the ground move beneath her feet and did what frightened creatures do, which is to grow reckless. She began to watch the post. So it was that a letter of the Duke's to his London solicitor, entrusted foolishly to a footman who owed his place and his loyalty to Isidora and not to his master, came into her hands before ever it reached the bag, and she read it, and learned from it enough, though by no means all, to understand that her brother and his paper wife were moving in concert against Quentin Vernon, the very man who had brought that wife into the house, and that there was evidence in it, and that some reckoning was coming to Wexmoor in which she had no part, and over which she had no power at all. She cornered Susanna the next afternoon in the conservatory, among the very glass-house warmth and the smell of wet earth and forced blossom that was the birthplace of everything hidden inside Susanna's gloves, and this time the pleasant surface was gone, or all but. "I know what you are," Isidora said, low and quick, her handsome face drawn tight over the bones. "I know you have set my brother on against a man of business over some grubby matter of accounts, and I know you came into this house as a debt paid off and mean to leave it its mistress, and I shall tell you what I have told myself since the hour you dragged your box up my steps. You do not belong here. You are a stray my brother took in out of some sickness of his grief, and when the grief passes, as grief does, he will see you at last, as the rest of us have seen you from the first, and you will go back to whatever hole you crawled up out of, whatever it is you carry hidden up your sleeve, whatever secret you guard so close. I will find it, and I will end you with it before I let a mill girl in borrowed lace take my place under my own roof." Susanna, who had been threatened by a true master of the art for 20 years, and knew to the ounce the difference between a threat spoken out of strength and one spoken out of terror, looked at her steadily and answered without heat. "It was never your roof, Isidora," she said. "It was your brother's, and you lived always in the fear that one day he might remember it. That is no doing of mine. I only chanced to arrive in the same season he began to wake." It was the cruelest thing she could have said, and it was entirely true, which was what made it cruel, and she watched it strike home, watched Isidora flinch as though slapped, and she felt no triumph in the striking, only the old, tired knowledge of what fear does to a person, and what a person driven by fear will do in turn. The county ball was Isidora's own creation, planned out months before ever Susanna came, the great fixed event of the Wexmoor season, and it could not now be put off without a scandal that would set every tongue in 3 parishes wagging. So it went forward, and it became, though none but 3 people in the house yet knew it, the ground upon which the whole of it would fall. The Duke's quiet inquiries were nearly complete by then. The London solicitor had written back. The investigator had confirmed item by item everything that Susanna's reading of the books had found, and more besides. And a magistrate of the county, old Sir Robert Cade, a friend of the Duke's late father and himself a governor of these 30 years past, of the very charity that Vernon had bled, had been quietly told the whole of it, and had agreed, at the Duke's asking, to be present at the ball. For Vernon himself would be there. He had been invited as the treasurer of the fund and as the guardian who had so generously made the match, and he would come to preen over what he took to be his triumph, and he would find, if all went as it was meant to, a very different evening than the one he had dressed for. The plan was a careful one, and a sound one. They would let the ball run its course, let Vernon drink and settle and grow easy and pleased with himself, and then, late in the evening, draw him aside into a private withdrawing-room with Sir Robert present, and there lay the whole of the evidence before him, and take him quietly, without a scene, without a stain upon the Duke's guests. It was a good plan. It did not survive its meeting with Lady Isidora Kingsley. Susanna stood at the head of the ballroom that night as its hostess, in a gown the Duke had ordered made for her in secret and without a word to his sister, a deep midnight blue cut with severe dignity and no frill, and upon her arms, of course, the long lace gloves, fresh and white to the elbow. The great room filled. The county came in its jewels and its ambitions and its long memories, and Susanna, who had spent the whole of her life in the corners of rooms, stood now in the very centre of this one and received it, and found to her own surprise that she could. The same stillness that had kept her safe in corners served her just as well in the full blaze of the chandeliers. The Dowager Lady Elmore, an ancient sharp-eyed woman whom no soul in 3 counties dared to cross, made a slow and deliberate point of crossing the whole length of the floor to speak with her, and looked her frankly up and down, and said in a voice pitched to carry a good way, "So you are the one they are all whispering of. Good. This house has wanted somebody worth the whispering these 3 years. The whispering before was all of it pity, and pity, my dear, is a dreadful bore. And she took Susanna's gloved arm and stood beside her a while in plain view, which in the language of that county was very near a coronation, and Susanna understood the gift of it, and was grateful. Quentin Vernon came late, and pleased with himself. A soft, heavy man with a benevolent open face he had spent a lifetime cultivating, like one of his forced peaches. He crossed to Susanna through the crowd, and took her gloved hand and kissed it before half the room, and called her his dear girl, and spoke, warmly, of how proud he was this night, how he had always known she would rise to great things, how it did an old guardian's heart good to see it. And Susanna let him. She smiled and gave him nothing, and thought behind the smile, "You do not know that I have carried you into this house folded in my trunk. You do not know the shape of the evening you are standing in." And she felt the coming reckoning steady inside her like a long breath held. But Isidora had been drinking, and Isidora had been watching, and Isidora had come down to the ball that night with the desperate settled certainty that whatever the mill girl's secret was, this, before the whole assembled county, was the night to tear it loose. She had never learned what it was. That was the thing Susanna understood only afterward, turning it over in the quiet. Isidora did not know. She knew only that the girl guarded her hands, that in all these weeks she had never once been seen without the gloves, not at dinner, not at cards, not in the muniment room in the warmth of the afternoon, and Isidora's cruelty had always had a low animal cunning to it that went straight for the soft place, and she had settled upon the gloves as the soft place, the thing to be torn away. She had no notion at all of what lay beneath them. She only wished to make the mill girl flinch and stammer and stand exposed as something small before the people who mattered, to remind them all with one stroke that this was no true lady, but a stray dressed up in blue. It happened near the height of the evening. The dancing had paused, the musicians resting their bows, and the great room had fallen quiet enough that a snapped fan would have been heard across it. Isidora came toward Susanna over the empty floor with her most dangerous smile fixed in place, and she said, in a bright, hard voice pitched to carry to every corner, "My dear, you really must let us all see your hands. Such gloves, and in such weather, and never once off, not even to dine, not in all these weeks. The whole county remarks upon it. Are you grown too fine to show your own fingers to your guests? Come, let us all see what our new Duchess keeps so close." And before Susanna could step back, before the Duke across the room could do more than turn his head at the sound of his sister's carrying voice, Isidora reached out and took hold of the lace at Susanna's right wrist and pulled. The glove came away all at once, turned half inside out, and Isidora, still smiling, still expecting the bare white society hand of a woman with an affectation, stripped the second glove after the first in the same motion, before her own eyes could send word to her mind of what they were showing her. Then she was standing there in the centre of the floor with 2 long white gloves hanging empty from her fist, and the whole assembly was looking, because the pull had made Susanna turn toward her, and had brought both her hands up between them, raised to the height of every eye in the room, palms and backs and wrists together, lifted into the full white light of 100 candles for the entire county to see. The room did not scream. It did the far worse thing. It went utterly silent, the silence of a great many people all understanding one terrible thing in the very same instant. The ridged and shining scars, the melted skin, the valleys where a child's hands had been burned down to the wrist and had healed again wrong, raised and lit and turned toward them all. It was no lady's delicate secret. It was the map of a childhood spent as a thing is spent, and every man and every woman in that room, whatever their own store of cruelty or of kindness, could read it in a glance for exactly what it was, and they could read, in the same glance, the woman who had done the reading of it aloud, standing there in the middle of the floor with the gloves still hanging from her hand, and the smile dying slowly on her mouth as she understood, far too late, what it was she had uncovered, and what it was she had made of herself in the uncovering. Susanna did not lower her hands. That was the thing the county remembered after, the thing the Dowager Lady Elmore spoke of for years to come. The mill girl did not snatch her hands down to hide them. She did not weep. She did not run. She stood, and she let them look, and then slowly she turned her scarred palms so that every last corner of the great room might see them plainly, and her face was not the face of a woman shamed. It was still, and it was terrible, and it was, past any mistaking, angry, the cold, clear anger of a person who has decided in a single second that if the truth is to be bared here tonight, then it shall be bared whole, and bared by her, and not made small by any hand but her own. She looked at Isadora over her raised hands, and she said, in a voice that was level and carried to the far walls, "You wish the county to see what I keep hidden. Here it is. This is what a child's hands look like when a man does his sums and finds she is worth less to him than the coal he saves by burning her. Look well. I have looked at them every morning of my life." And the room, which had been silent with shock, began to fill instead with a different silence, the silence of a great many people all rearranging at once, everything they had thought they knew about the mill girl and the fine sister. And it was not the mill girl who came out of it the poorer. Then the Duke was there. He came across the floor fast, faster than dignity allowed, and some who saw it said after that they had never once in their lives seen him move so, and he did not go to his sister. He went to his wife. He was stripping off his coat as he came, the fine dark coat of the master of Wexmoor, and he did not cast it over her hands to hide them, as a man hides a shame. He did another thing. He took her raised hands into both of his own, there in the middle of the floor before the whole of the county, the scarred palms bare against his bare palms, and he did not lower them but held them up, and turned, so that he and she together faced the room, so that there could be no mistaking in any mind present that he had seen what they had all seen, and that he claimed it, claimed her, held her ruined hands in his, and counted it an honour to be seen holding them. And then he spoke, and his voice, which had made a religion of distance for 3 long years, was not distant now in the least. "These hands," he said, and the room heard every word, "found £38 stolen out of my accounts in a single afternoon, when no man I pay could find it. These hands have set right a century of my family's papers, that my own grief let fall to ruin. And these hands were burned, when the woman who wears them was a child, by a man who sent her down into the dark to tend his fires and reckoned it cheaper to scar her than to clad his iron. That man stands in this room tonight. He is not my wife. He is the man who calls himself her guardian, and calls himself the treasurer of your children's charity, and has robbed the both of them alike." He turned his head then, and looked at his sister, who stood white and shaking with the gloves still hanging empty from her fist, and his voice dropped and went flat and even and quiet, the voice of a man giving an order he means to give only the once. "You have shamed yourself in my house," he said, "before every neighbour I have, and you did it not even knowing what you would find, which is the worst of all of it, for it means you did this thing out of nothing in the world but spite. Leave my house. Leave it tonight. You will go to the dower house at the far end of the park, and you will not come through these doors again until you are asked, and you will not be asked soon. Leave my house tonight." He said it twice, the same words exactly, and it was the twice of it that made it final and unanswerable, and Isadora, after a moment in which she seemed to wait for some one soul in all that great crowded glittering room to rise and take her part, and found that not a single person there would so much as meet her eye, let the 2 white gloves fall from her hand to the floor, and turned and walked out through the silent county, and the crowd parted before her, the way a crowd parts for a thing it has finished with. The Duke did not let the room settle. He had meant to take Vernon quietly and late and in private, but that plan was burned up now in the blaze of what his sister had done, and he saw, quick as Susanna herself would have seen it, that the moment was here instead, and that it was in truth the better moment, and he did not waste it. He kept one of Susanna's hands in his, and he raised his voice again over the assembly. "Since we are all of us gathered," he said, "and since the truth has been so ill served in this room tonight, let it now be served well. Mr. Halloway." And Halloway came forward out of the crowd with a plain leather case under his arm, having stood ready by the door the whole evening, and the Duke called next for Sir Robert Cade, and the old magistrate rose from among the guests where he had sat unremarked all the night through, and the county, which had come out for a ball, understood of a sudden that it was about to be made witness to something else entirely, and not one soul among them left the room. The papers were laid out along a table drawn up to the head of the floor. The Duke set out the subscription books of the charity, and the bound report of the London Investigator, and the letters returned unopened from suppliers, who had turned out to have no existence, and he spoke, plainly and for only a few minutes, of what had been found, that the fund raised across this county over 11 years for the schooling of its orphans had been steadily and cleverly robbed by the very man trusted to keep its books, so that the schoolmasters had gone unpaid and the children gone hungry and cold, while the money bought horses and wine and settled the private debts of Quentin Vernon. Vernon had risen from his chair. His benevolent open face had gone the colour of cold tallow, and he began to bluster, to speak loudly of slander and of ingratitude, of his long years of selfless service, and he flung out a shaking hand towards Susanna and named her a liar and a hysteric who had poisoned a great man's mind against a good one. And the Duke let him talk himself dry, and then said only, "You may explain the figures to the county yourself if you can, but my wife shall read them first. She has earned, I think, the reading of them." And Susanna stepped to the table. She did not draw her gloves back on. She never wore them again, though she did not yet know that on that night. She reached into the leather case and drew out her own book, the small worn ledger written in her father's cipher that she had carried into this house folded in the bottom of her trunk and guarded through all the long weeks, and she laid it open on the table beside Vernon's fine-bound one, and she began to read, and the great room was so silent that her voice, level and clear and wholly unhurried, reached into every corner of it. She read the figures. She did not rage, and she did not weep, and she did not repeat herself, for she had a horror of a thing said twice where once would do. She read them the way her father had taught her to read them, one book against the other, the charge in Vernon's hand and its true shadow in her own. Here the coal that was never delivered, and there, in her own cipher, the coal money that had bought a bay hunter at the Michaelmas fair. Here the schoolhouse roof paid for and repaired 3 separate winters, and there the same 3 sums walked quietly across to a wine merchant in the county town within the very same weeks. Here a widow of the parish, a woman who took in washing, her single hard-won guinea set down as given for the orphans, and there that guinea traced onward, figure by figure, into the marriage portion that Quentin Vernon had settled upon his own ward to make the county call him generous, the dowry, paid out whole from the orphans' fund that had dressed the selling of her as a gift. She read that last one slowly, and she lifted her eyes once from the page and looked at Vernon across the silent room and said, "You paid for me with the orphans' money. I saw the settlement drawn, and I knew to the shilling where every part of it came from. I could not prove it then because I had no standing in the world to be believed. I have standing now." And she looked down and read on, figure after figure after figure, each one different from the last, until the whole decade of the theft lay open and plain upon the table in her steady, unhurried voice, and there was nothing left of the great benevolent man of business but a shaking figure in a good coat, in a room full of people, not one of whom would ever again take his part. Sir Robert Cade rose when she had done. He was an old man, and a slow one to rouse, but he had been a governor of that charity for 30 years, and his voice, when at last it came, was not slow at all. He said that he had heard enough, and more than enough, that he had come this night at the Duke's asking already half persuaded, and was now persuaded to the marrow, and that Quentin Vernon stood under arrest, from this hour, for the theft of a charitable trust, and for a long fraud upon the whole county, and that the assizes should settle the rest of it. He called forward the 2 quiet men he had brought and kept by the door all evening, and they came and took Vernon by the arms, and the great man who had spent his life being called good was walked out through the county he had robbed, and the county watched him go in a silence that was its own kind of verdict, colder than any hiss. He was tried at the spring assizes, and convicted upon the strength of the 2 books read across one another, the false and the true, and he was sentenced to be transported beyond the seas for the term of his natural life. He sailed in the autumn, and was never heard of again in that county, and the mill and the 50 families who worked it, freed of him, did a good deal better without him than ever they had done with him, which surprised no one who had ever watched the man work. The house was very quiet in the weeks that came after the ball, the deep quiet of a place that has weathered a great storm and is learning, cautiously, the new shape of its calm. Susanna went about it bare-handed. It frightened her at first, more than she had thought it would, to walk the corridors and sit down at the table and hand a letter to a footman with her scars in the plain light of day, and she had braced herself for the old recoil she had spent her whole life stepping around. It did not come. The servants, who had always known the true shape of great houses long before their masters troubled to learn it, treated her exactly as they had before, only with something now added to it that had not been there, a respect that was owed to no rank at all but earned entire by what the county had watched her bear and how she had borne it. Bess wept the first time she saw the bare hands, and then scolded herself briskly for a fool, and never once mentioned them again, which was precisely the right thing to have done, and Susanna loved her for it, as she had loved few people living. Halloway, who came now to consult her daily on the accounts as a matter settled and unremarkable, did not so much as glance at her hands, only at the figures, which was his own particular way of telling her that in his reckoning they had never once been the thing that mattered about her. One evening near the end of that quiet season, Susanna sat alone in her room before she slept, and she took the 4 pairs of lace gloves from the drawer where they had lived so long, washed and mended and forever ready, the whole patient apparatus of a secret kept like a machine that must never fail, and she looked at them a good while. Then she folded them together, all 4 pairs, and laid them in the bottom of a box, and closed the lid upon them. She did not throw them on the fire. She was not a woman given to grand gestures of discarding, and besides, waste offended her. She only set them by, finished with, a tool she had no further use for, and she sat a while with her bare scarred hands open in her lap in the candlelight, and she named the feeling in her precisely as her father had taught her, for a feeling named is a feeling brought to heel and a feeling possessed. It was not anger tonight. It took her a long time to find the word, because she had had so little use for it in her life that it had gone strange to her, and when she found it, she very nearly smiled. It was safety. She had not felt it since she was 11 years old, in a house that smelled of lamp oil and ink. She sat with it a long while, unafraid of the dark, and then she put out the candle and slept, without the thin cotton gloves, for the first night in more years than she could readily count. She and Thaddeus were married already, of course, by paper and by law, married as a debt is settled and a mortgage discharged. But in the early summer, when the storms had all of them blown through and the county had settled its judgment firmly, and for good upon the side of the mill girl who had read a great thief to ruin in her own steady voice, they were married a second time, in the small grey stone chapel at the edge of the Wexmoor Park, and this time it was no transaction, and no settlement, and no thing done to either of them by any other hand. It was a thing that the 2 of them chose. There were few there to see it. Bess stood up beside Susanna and wept again, and did not scold herself for it this time. Halloway gave her away, which is not the office of a steward, and which he performed with so grave and quiet a pride that no one present found it strange. The Dowager Lady Elmore came, uninvited, having heard of it, and having decided in her way that she would not be kept from it by anything short of death, and she sat in the front pew and dabbed at her sharp old eyes, and said afterward loudly to whoever would hear her that it was the only wedding she had attended in 40 years, at which both parties looked as though they entirely meant it, and that meaning it was grown so rare a thing among people of quality that it ought by rights to be remarked upon and set down. Susanna wore no gloves. She held Thaddeus's hands in her own bare scarred ones before the altar, and he held hers, and when the words were said he did not kiss her cheek in the cool, careful way of their first cold wedding, but kissed her mouth, plainly, before the small glad company, and it was the first time in the whole of Susanna Larkin's life that she had been kissed by a person who knew every last thing there was to know about her, and wanted her still, and wanted her the more for the knowing, and she found that it was, after everything, a thing that had been worth the long wait. Isadora came to it too, in her way, though not to the chapel. She had not been asked, and had by then learned better than to come uninvited where the mill girl was concerned. But at the spring assembly of the following year, the great gathering of the whole county where 1 12-month before she had reigned as its unquestioned queen, She came forward into the crowded hall before the very same neighbours who had watched her tear the gloves from her brother's wife, and she did a thing that not one soul who knew her had believed was still in her to do. She went to Susanna, and before them all, she knelt. It was not gracefully done. Pride does not learn to kneel gracefully in a single hard year. But she knelt, and she said, in a voice that shook and did not trouble to hide its shaking, that she had done a wicked thing out of a coward's fear of losing her place, that she had struck at a stranger only to make herself feel large, and that she had learned, in the long silent months at the dower house with no one at all to command and nothing left to run, exactly how small a thing she had made of herself in the doing of it. She asked pardon. She did not ask to be restored to anything, having the sense at last not to. She asked only to be forgiven and left it there, kneeling for the county to make of it what it would. Susanna looked down at her a long moment. She knew fear when she saw it. She had known it all her life, from both the giving and the receiving ends of it, and she knew that this was fear that had at last turned and looked squarely at itself and been sickened by what it found, which was the only kind of remorse she had ever thought worth the name. And so she reached down with her bare, scarred hand, the very hand that Isidora had bared before the county, and she took Isidora's hand in it, and drew her up onto her feet, and said quietly, so that the whole listening room was obliged to lean in to hear her, "I forgive you, not because you have earned it, for I am not certain such a thing can ever be earned, but because I know what fear makes of a person, and I would rather not carry yours through my life as well as my own. You may come to the house, slowly, and we shall see in time what the two of us may make of one another." And the Dowager Lady Elmore, watching the whole of it from her chair with her sharp old eyes, said to the neighbour beside her, in a carrying whisper that was very plainly meant to be overheard by the entire assembly, "There, that is what breeding looks like, and it did not come out of a great house, and let that be a lesson to the whole pack of you." And the county, which had learned a great deal in 1 year about where breeding came from, and where it most certainly did not, took the lesson to heart, and Isidora came back slowly into the family, chastened and useful, and never again what she had been, which proved a mercy to every soul concerned, herself not the least among them. 3 years on, upon a wet afternoon much like the grey one that had first brought her up the great stone steps, hauling her own trunk behind her, Susanna sat in the muniment room at Wexmoor, which was no longer a stone cell of forgotten and mouldering papers, but a proper archive, catalogued and shelved and ordered throughout in her own steady hand, the patient work of years, and now the quiet pride of the whole estate. Halloway consulted it daily and deferred to it always. Scholars had begun to write from the university, asking leave to come and see this or that ancient charter, and the granting of that leave was hers to give or to withhold. The charity school ran again, and ran honestly now, its books kept straight and square, and Susanna kept them herself, every figure of every column, so that no orphan of that county should ever again go cold to pay for a great man's hunter. Her bare, scarred hands moved over the open ledgers in the grey light from the tall windows, quick and sure and wholly unhidden, and no one who came into that room now so much as glanced at them a second time, for they had long since become simply her hands, the hands that kept the county's accounts honest, and there was no shame anywhere within a mile of them. By the fire at the far end of the long room, a small boy of not quite 2 years, Thomas Kingsley, had fallen asleep upon the hearthrug with a wooden horse still gripped in one fat fist, worn clean out by an afternoon of the tremendous and exhausting business of being not quite 2. His father sat near him in a low chair, a letter open and unread in his hand, watching the boy sleep, which was an occupation Thaddeus Kingsley never seemed to tire of, and which had done more to mend the long grief he had carried than any physician's draught had ever done. Susanna looked up from her ledgers and let her eyes rest a moment upon the two of them, the sleeping child and the man who had taught himself at last never to stand back at a careful distance from the things he loved, and she rested one scarred hand, without quite thinking of it, upon the gentle rise of her belly, where a second child, due in the autumn, was even now making its small, quiet arguments felt, and she named the feeling in her, out of long habit, precisely because her father had taught her before all else that a feeling named is a feeling possessed. It was not anger. It was not tonight even only safety, though safety was folded somewhere within it. It was home. She had been handed to this house to settle a debt, dragged up its wet steps with her wounds gloved and her proof locked in the false bottom of her trunk, and no reason on the whole of the earth to look for anything from it, but more of exactly what she had always had. And she had made of it, in the end, out of nothing at all but her own patience and her own steady eye, and her own flat refusal ever to be made small, a place that was entirely and permanently and unanswerably hers, where her hands were shown to the light and her worth was known to all, and her children would grow up never once learning the particular cold arithmetic of being counted as a thing worth less than iron. She bent her head to her books again, and the rain ran down the tall grey windows,